Okay, good morning. Today I'm going to be replacing the fuel gauge sending unit in my 66. One thing that I want to stress right off the bat from the very beginning, you are playing around with fumes from the gasoline and you want to be certain that you don't spark anything. The fuel tank, fuel line is all stainless steel. So it doesn't spark easily, but you're still playing around with fumes. So keep all sparks, all ignition sources away while you are replacing your fuel gauge sending unit. The float on the old one sank and I repaired it. You can solder those things up, but I think it may have cracked again and it might be sinking again, so I'm just going to go ahead and replace it. Okay, the steps for replacing the fuel sending unit are fairly straightforward. You have, well, it's not in the camera, but you have a ground wire, this wire right here that goes up on the back wall here. And then you're going to have 5 bolts to take out. You have the wire that goes to the fuel gauge, and then you have the hose that's 9/16 and 1/2 inch to fuel line. I've already got everything out, and what I'm going to do is carefully work the fuel gauge sending unit out, and then I'll work the new one in. And there's the old one, and it is out. And now I'm going to work the new one in after I take this old gasket off. So I'm going to stop this thing and take the gasket off. Okay, gasket's all cleaned off. There's the new gasket. And there's the new sending unit, all nice and bright and shiny. Try to get it, there we go. Kind of hard to get it where people can see it. Anyway, got to work the gasket on, which takes just a little bit of finagling. And right on up it goes. And I know you can't see this, it's hard to hold the camera and do all of this at the same time. And then you have to make sure that you hang on to the float so that it doesn't wobble all over the place, and then slowly but surely you start working things in very carefully. Right on down in. You shouldn't have to force anything. It should just kind of wobble right on down in there. And by the way, when you're doing this, you want to be sure that your fuel tank is below half. You can't see my finger, but make sure it's below where this sending unit is. I already knew that mine was. And your last step would be to start screws in, and I'm sure you don't want to watch me do all of that. So what I'll probably wind up doing is I'm going to start this one screw. Where's the hole for the gasket? Right there. Now, like I said, this process is fairly straightforward. So basically, it's just an easy task if you have a problem with a fuel gauge sending unit. And right there. And the first screw is started, and then I'm going to shut this thing off, and we'll talk to you again here in a minute. Fuel gauge sending unit is all back in. Grounding screws back on. Sending wires back on. Fuel gauge wires back on. Pipes are hooked up. It is important not to cross thread these. That is one thing you always want to do, is make sure that it's hand started. Make sure it's hand started before you start using any wrenches on it. These are all snug. Same thing goes with bolts, nuts. Make sure they're all hand started before you start using any wrenches on it. Anyways, one important note: you are working with fuel and fumes. This gas tank is stainless steel. This sending unit should be stainless steel. You notice that this is brass right there. This fuel line should be stainless steel. None of it should spark, but you need to be certain that you do not cause any sparks while you're playing with this area. Okay, let's see if this thing works. Moment of truth. You notice that the fuel gauge says empty. Everything's off. Turn the ignition on, and it comes up to about half full, which is about where this thing was at whenever the other one was in there. So it should be working. Only time will tell, but it should be working. Now, onto the repairs I told you that I made on the old sending unit. It had a crack in this float, and these floats are made out of brass. If you carefully do it, you can work it out of this holder, and then you clean this area real well with some 300 grit sandpaper and get it good and clean. And then using a little bit of soldering resin, you dab it around the area and around the crack. If you still have fluid inside of this float, you drill yourself 2 holes on either end of the crack, which you're going to have to do anyways to stop the crack, and then you can get to rattle it around and get the fuel out of it. And then using a standard soldering iron, after you have let this sit for a while and all the fuel's gotten out of it, using a standard high amp soldering iron, you can heat this area up and solder it and then smooth it out. I had to repair this thing twice because when I was putting it back in, I cracked it again right there. But it worked all this time, and it does not have any fuel in it. I thought it might have. This does make it a little bit heavier. It will make it a little bit heavier, so it will not register properly, but it will register better than no gauge at all.